The trail quickly changed as the teenagers ventured deeper into the Colorado wilderness. At first, it was wide and well marked, with families and couples passing by, exchanging cheerful greetings. But within an hour of steady hiking, the path narrowed, twisting between towering pine trees that seemed to close in on them with every step. Shafts of sunlight pierced through the canopy, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow on the forest floor. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. The chatter of other hikers faded, replaced by the whisper of the wind and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The group didn't mind. In fact, they thrived in the sense of adventure that came with the solitude. One of the boys, eager to show off his sense of humor, pointed at a tree that had a strange marking carved into its bark. The etching looked like overlapping triangles, almost like an arrow pointing into the woods. Probably some mountain graffiti, he joked, brushing it off as a bored hiker's carving. Another friend snapped a quick photo of it, teasing that maybe it was a secret treasure map. They all laughed, unaware of how unsettling that carving might look to someone years later. As the trail grew steeper, the air grew cooler. Their sneakers and boots scuffed against loose stones, and their breathing became heavier. The forest had its own soundtrack now, crows cawing in the distance, the faint rustle of something unseen moving through the underbrush. Occasionally, one of them would stop and listen, insisting they'd heard footsteps behind them. But each time, when they turned around, the trail was empty. They brushed it off as paranoia and continued onward. Despite the growing eeriness of the woods, the friends pushed forward with excitement. They cracked jokes, challenged each other to climb faster, and posed dramatically on fallen logs, turning the hike into their own photo shoot. One girl balanced on a rock near a stream, arms stretched wide like she was on top of the world. The others cheered and captured the moment with the instant camera, tucking the fresh photo into a backpack pocket. Still, something about the atmosphere shifted. The once inviting trail seemed to weave deeper and deeper into the unknown, as if pulling them in. The trees grew denser, their branches tangled above like interlocking fingers, blocking out more of the sky. The sense of direction became less clear, but none of the friends admitted it. They wanted to believe they were in control, that adventure was exactly what they signed up for. What they didn't realize was that with each step, they were leaving the familiar trail behind and walking toward a fate that no map, no guide, and no rescue team would ever fully explain. The trail quickly changed as the teenagers ventured deeper into the Colorado wilderness. At first, it was wide and well marked, with families and couples passing by, exchanging cheerful greetings. But within an hour of steady hiking, the path narrowed, twisting between towering pine trees that seemed to close in on them with every step. Shafts of sunlight pierced through the canopy, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow on the forest floor. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. The chatter of other hikers faded, replaced by the whisper of the wind and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The group didn't mind. In fact, they thrived in the sense of adventure that came with the solitude. One of the boys, eager to show off his sense of humor, pointed at a tree that had a strange marking carved into its bark. The etching looked like overlapping triangles, almost like an arrow pointing into the woods. Probably some mountain graffiti, he joked, brushing it off as a bored hiker's carving. Another friend snapped a quick photo of it, teasing that maybe it was a secret treasure map. They all laughed, unaware of how unsettling that carving might look to someone years later. As the trail grew steeper, the air grew cooler. Their sneakers and boots scuffed against loose stones, and their breathing became heavier. The forest had its own soundtrack now, crows cawing in the distance, the faint rustle of something unseen moving through the underbrush. Occasionally, one of them would stop and listen, insisting they'd heard footsteps behind them. But each time, when they turned around, the trail was empty. They brushed it off as paranoia and continued onward. Despite the growing eeriness of the woods, the friends pushed forward with excitement. They cracked jokes, challenged each other to climb faster, and posed dramatically on fallen logs, turning the hike into their own photo shoot. One girl balanced on a rock near a stream, arms stretched wide like she was on top of the world. The others cheered and captured the moment with the instant camera, tucking the fresh photo into a backpack pocket. Still, something about the atmosphere shifted. The once inviting trail seemed to weave deeper and deeper into the unknown, as if pulling them in. The trees grew denser, their branches tangled above like interlocking fingers, blocking out more of the sky. The sense of direction became less clear, but none of the friends admitted it. They wanted to believe they were in control, that adventure was exactly what they signed up for. What they didn't realize was that with each step, they were leaving the familiar trail behind and walking toward a fate that no map, no guide, and no rescue team would ever fully explain. Here's the expanded Scene 3 in a detailed storytelling style, around 2,200 characters. By late afternoon, the forest had taken on an entirely different character. The sunlight, once so warm and golden, now filtered through the trees at sharp angles, painting long shadows that stretched across the trail. The teenagers had been climbing for hours, and though tired, they were exhilarated. Their laughter echoed between the trees, a defiant sound against the silence of the mountains. They finally reached a rocky clearing, a natural ledge that overlooked a valley below. From here, the mountains rolled endlessly, a sea of peaks fading into the horizon. The view was breathtaking, the kind of sight that made every sore muscle and bead of sweat worth it. One of the boys stretched his arms wide, shouting into the open air, his voice bouncing back in faint echoes. Another girl pulled out her camera, snapping photo after photo, determined to capture the magic of the moment. They set down their backpacks and rested, sitting in a loose circle on the ground. Someone handed out granola bars, another passed a bottle of water, and the group enjoyed a small picnic surrounded by nature. Between bites, they talked about their futures, about college, careers, and the dreams they were chasing. One of them confessed they wanted to travel the world, another admitted they were scared about leaving their hometown. The mood softened, becoming more reflective. In that quiet mountain clearing, with the world stretched out beneath them, they felt both small and infinite at the same time. As they relaxed, one friend pulled out a journal and began scribbling notes. She said she wanted to remember the details, the way the wind felt cooler at the ridge, the smell of pine sap in the air, the golden haze of the late afternoon sun. The others teased her, calling her the poet, but secretly admired how she captured what they were all feeling. A sudden gust of wind rustled through the trees, scattering loose leaves and chilling the air. One boy joked that it was the mountain spirit, telling them to go home, and everyone laughed nervously. They didn't realize how close to the truth that joke might have been. The sun continued to dip lower, edging closer to the horizon. The shadows grew longer, the colors of the sky shifting to orange and pink. It was beautiful, almost surreal, but it was also a sign. If they didn't start heading back soon, they would be caught in the forest at night. None of them voiced the concern, though. For now, they were too caught up in the beauty, too lost in the magic of their shared moment. What none of them knew was that this clearing, this joyful pause in their journey, would be the last place anyone would ever remember them alive. That evening, as the sun slipped behind the peaks and shadows swallowed the trail, the group of friends began their descent. The forest, which had felt alive and adventurous during the day, now seemed colder, more foreboding. The laughter that had carried them through the climb grew quieter as the air thickened with an uneasy stillness. Their flashlights weren't yet switched on, but the dim light made every tree look taller, every shadow deeper. Somewhere along the way, they paused to send quick text messages to their families. The notes were short, casual, reassuring, "We're good, hiking back now, see you tonight, almost done, don't worry." Parents reading those messages felt comforted at the time, not realizing they would be the last words they'd ever receive from their children. The phones buzzed with delivered notifications, but there would be no replies later that night. As the trail grew darker, the group tried to keep their spirits high. They sang little snippets of songs, told inside jokes, and teased one another about who would trip first in the fading light. But beneath their laughter was an unspoken urgency, an awareness that they had lingered too long at the clearing. One friend pointed out the time and suggested they hurry. Another brushed it off, insisting they were fine. The debate lasted only a moment before they pressed on, trusting that the trail would lead them back safely. Yet, the forest was changing. Familiar markers they remembered from earlier, the fallen log, the fork in the path, the stream where they'd posed for pictures, suddenly seemed harder to spot. The trees all looked the same, their bark dark and indistinguishable in the twilight. One girl swore they had already passed a certain boulder, while another argued they hadn't. A subtle tension began to creep into their voices. By the time they reached a thicker patch of woods, their flashlights were finally switched on. Beams of light cut through the darkness in narrow cones, illuminating only what lay directly ahead, leaving the rest of the forest cloaked in shadow. The crunch of their boots on the dirt trail felt louder now, as though the silence of the mountain pressed in around them. Back at home, hours passed. Parents grew uneasy as midnight neared and their children still hadn't returned. Calls went straight to voicemail, text messages remained unread. At first, the families reassured themselves, maybe the group had stopped for food, maybe they had lost track of time. But as the night dragged on, comfort gave way to dread. Something was wrong. By the time the clock struck 2 a.m., the parents knew the truth they didn't want to admit. Their children weren't just late. They were missing. The first light of dawn revealed a flurry of activity at the base of the mountain. As news spread that the teenagers hadn't returned, search and rescue teams were mobilized immediately. Parents stood anxiously near the trailhead, clinging to one another for strength as volunteers, police officers, and rangers gathered in clusters, planning the operation. The abandoned SUV, still parked in the gravel lot where the friends had left it the day before, stood as a haunting reminder. They had gone into the forest but never come back out. Helicopters circled overhead, the thumping of their blades echoing through the valley, while rescue dogs strained at their leashes, sniffing eagerly for any trace of the missing hikers. Teams in bright orange jackets moved in lines, calling out names that carried into the woods, swallowed quickly by the endless trees. Every rustle in the brush, every shadow between the trunks made hearts race with hope, only for silence to answer back. As hours turned into days, the search intensified. Trails were scoured, streams were crossed, and steep ridges were climbed. Crews combed through ravines and rocky clearings, retracing every step the teenagers could have taken. Their pictures were passed around, smiling faces full of youth and energy, now taped to boards at the command post, staring out at the strangers who had dedicated themselves to finding them. Volunteers brought food, water, and flashlights, while townspeople left flowers and candles near the trailhead. News crews arrived, their cameras capturing the anguish of families who pleaded for information. Parents gave interviews with trembling voices, begging their children to, please hold on, and, come home. Their words were broadcast across the state, touching hearts far beyond Colorado, as the disappearance became one of the most talked about mysteries in the region. Despite the overwhelming effort, the mountain offered nothing. Not a shoeprint, not a scrap of clothing, not even a broken branch that could prove the teenagers' direction. Searchers returned night after night with weary eyes and empty hands. The forest, vast and indifferent, kept its secrets well. Weeks passed, and hope began to fracture. The search slowly scaled back, resources redirected, though families refused to give up. They returned to the trailhead on their own, carrying flashlights and prayers, walking the same paths in desperation. Each time, they were met with the same outcome: silence, emptiness, and the unbearable weight of not knowing. The SUV was finally towed away, but the image of it sitting abandoned lingered in everyone's minds. The mountain had swallowed their children whole, and no one could explain how or why. The weeks turned into months, and the months into years. What began as a breaking news tragedy eventually faded into one of Colorado's most haunting unsolved mysteries. The case of the vanished teenagers was kept alive only by the aching hearts of their families and the unanswered questions that lingered like ghosts in the mountain air. Every year, on the anniversary of their disappearance, parents, siblings, and friends gathered at the trailhead for a candlelight vigil. They stood in the gravel lot where the SUV had once been parked, holding photographs of smiling faces, their eyes lit with youth and possibility. Songs were sung, prayers whispered, and balloons released into the sky, drifting upward as if carrying messages to the children they could no longer reach. Some nights, the families swore they felt their presence in the cool mountain breeze, as though the forest itself held their voices. Despite the grief, not all hope was lost. Parents clung to the belief that maybe, just maybe, their children had gotten lost, found shelter, and somehow survived in a hidden corner of the vast wilderness. Others tortured themselves with darker possibilities they dared not speak aloud. Did someone cross their path that night? Had they stumbled into danger, or had the mountain claimed them in some cruel accident no one would ever discover? The forest itself seemed to carry the weight of the unanswered story. Over time, the trail grew quieter, fewer hikers daring to wander too deep into the same woods where the teenagers vanished. Those who did often spoke of a strange stillness in certain areas, as if the mountain itself remembered. Local legends began to grow, whispers of cursed trails and restless spirits. For outsiders, it was folklore. For the families, it was unbearable. Birthdays came and went. Christmases and Thanksgivings passed with empty chairs at the table. The parents never stopped setting out their children's photos, never stopped hoping for a knock at the door, a phone call, any sign that would end the nightmare. But each passing year made hope harder to hold on to. By the 5th year, the mystery had settled into a painful silence. The case was considered cold, though detectives still kept files in their drawers, waiting for a lead that never came. For the community, the disappearance was a wound that never healed. For the families, it was a daily ache that time could not dull. And yet, beneath the forest floor, buried deep in the soil, the truth waited, patient, silent, and hidden. It would not stay that way forever. 5 long years after the teenagers disappeared, the trail where they had last been seen had grown quiet. The mystery still lingered in whispers, but life had moved forward. Then, on an otherwise ordinary morning, fate intervened. A construction crew arrived near the edge of the forest, just a few miles from the hiking trail, to begin clearing land for a new development. The project was routine, digging foundations, moving soil, leveling the earth. No one expected that the mountain still held secrets waiting to be unearthed. The workers moved methodically, their shovels and heavy equipment cutting into the ground that had been untouched for decades. The hum of machinery and the clatter of tools filled the air, a stark contrast to the quiet of the woods. Hours passed uneventfully until, mid-morning, one of the crewmen's shovels struck something unusual. It didn't sound like stone. The metallic clink rang oddly, hollow against the earth. Curious, he knelt down and brushed the soil aside with his hands. At first, it seemed like just tangled roots and debris, but as more dirt was cleared, the outline of a fabric strap emerged. The worker tugged, pulling free a faded, mud-caked backpack. The color was nearly gone, its surface torn and weathered by years underground. The crew paused, exchanging uneasy glances. Something about the discovery didn't feel right. People lose things in the woods all the time, but why would a backpack be buried so deep? Word spread quickly among the workers, and soon the foreman was on site, crouched beside the strange find. Carefully, they opened the backpack. Inside were fragments of belongings. A cracked cell phone, its screen shattered but still recognizable, a broken flashlight with rust creeping along the metal, and a handful of personal items, buttons, a faded notebook, and what looked like a water bottle with stickers peeling from its sides. None of it seemed recent. A heavy silence fell over the crew. One worker muttered that it might belong to a camper who got lost years ago. But another recognized something chilling. He remembered the case, the missing teenagers, the vigils, the news stories that had gripped the town 5 years earlier. The foreman didn't waste a second. He pulled out his phone and called the authorities, his voice low and tense as he explained what they'd uncovered. By the time he hung up, the atmosphere had shifted. The hum of machinery stopped. Workers stood in uneasy clusters, staring at the patch of disturbed earth, all of them wondering the same thing. Had they just stumbled onto the truth behind one of Colorado's most haunting mysteries? Within the hour, sheriffs, deputies and crime scene investigators arrived at the site, their vehicles stirring up dust along the dirt road. Yellow tape was quickly strung around the disturbed patch of ground as workers stood off to the side, whispering among themselves. The construction site, once alive with the noise of machinery, now fell eerily silent except for the low murmur of radios and the clicking of cameras documenting the scene. Everyone sensed it, this was no ordinary discovery. The investigators carefully examined the weathered backpack that had been pulled from the soil. Inside, each item was laid out methodically on a tarp. The cracked cell phone, its screen long dead, the rusted flashlight that no longer clicked on, and a tattered notebook, the ink smudged and pages warped from years underground. The personal belongings were heartbreakingly ordinary, yet deeply unsettling, because they matched descriptions from the missing persons reports filed years earlier. The sheriff's face grew grim as he studied the evidence. He remembered the case well, 5 teenagers who had gone hiking and never come back. He had stood at the trailhead during those desperate early days, watching parents beg for answers, and now here it was. After years of silence, the mountain was finally speaking. As investigators dug deeper into the soil, their tools struck something harder than earth. The ground gave way to fragments of fabric and more personal items, a torn hiking boot, its laces still knotted, a plastic water bottle, cracked down the side, and a cluster of small trinkets, bracelets, a keychain shaped like a mountain, and the warped frame of an instant photo. When one officer carefully brushed the dirt away from the photo, a ghostly image emerged, 5 smiling faces, arms slung over each other's shoulders, frozen in the joy of that day. The workers who had gathered nearby turned pale. A few stepped back, shaken. There was no denying it now. These were not just lost belongings. This was evidence of something much darker, something that had been hidden in the ground all these years. The sheriff radioed for additional support, his voice tight. "Secure the perimeter. No one in or out." The tone made clear what many already suspected. This was now a recovery mission, not just an investigation. The soil that had kept its silence for half a decade was beginning to reveal its secrets. And with each artifact pulled from the ground, the weight of the mystery deepened. What had happened to those teenagers in the Colorado wilderness? The answer, it seemed, lay just a few shovels deeper. The excavation grew heavier as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the site. Floodlights were set up, bathing the soil in a cold, artificial glow as investigators and forensic experts worked tirelessly. Every movement was slow, deliberate, careful. Not a single scoop of dirt was taken without documentation. What began as the discovery of a backpack had become something far greater. As the team dug deeper, the earth began to yield its darkest secret. A brush swept across the soil, and a fragment of fabric emerged, a sleeve from a weather-worn jacket. Beneath it, pale shapes began to surface, their outlines faint but unmistakable. The silence around the site thickened. Even the workers who had lingered nearby stepped back, no longer whispering, their faces pale with unease. The first human remains were uncovered just before midnight. A pair of hiking boots still clung to skeletal feet, the laces intact despite years underground. Bits of clothing clung stubbornly to the frame, faded but recognizable. The forensic team paused, the air tense with the weight of the discovery. Slowly, carefully, more remains were revealed, bones pressed into the soil, their arrangement suggesting hurried concealment rather than natural rest. One by one, investigators realized this was no accident, no simple tragedy of hikers lost to the wilderness. Something had happened here, something that left these young lives buried together beneath the soil. Personal belongings were catalogued alongside the remains: a cracked pair of glasses, a dented thermos, a broken wristwatch frozen at 7:42. Each item carried with it the story of the teenagers' last moments, silent witnesses to whatever horror had unfolded that night. At the command post nearby, radios buzzed with updates, and officers quietly spoke of contacting the families. No one wanted to make that call, but it had to be done. After 5 years of searching, of vigils, of questions that never found answers, there was finally something concrete to give back, though it was not the news any parent ever wanted to hear. When word spread to the town, shock rippled like an earthquake. People gathered outside their homes, the flicker of television screens illuminating faces etched with disbelief. Candlelit vigils reignited spontaneously as tears flowed once more. The community that had carried this mystery in its heart for half a decade was suddenly thrust into the painful reality. The teenagers had been found, but closure would come wrapped in grief and more questions than ever before. The ground had given up its silence, but the truth was still buried deeper, hidden in the shadows of the Colorado wilderness. The official announcement came 2 days later, delivered at a press conference crowded with reporters, flashing cameras, and families who had waited 5 agonizing years for answers. The sheriff stood at the podium, his expression grave, the weight of his words pressing down like the mountains themselves. He confirmed what many already knew in their hearts: the remains found at the construction site belonged to the missing teenagers. Gasps echoed through the room. Mothers clutched photographs to their chests, fathers bowed their heads, siblings wept openly. Though the mystery of their disappearance had been solved in part, the truth that surfaced was far more haunting. Forensic teams confirmed the remains had not been scattered by wildlife or nature, they had been deliberately buried. Someone had taken the time to conceal them. This revelation shifted the entire narrative. What had once been thought of as a tragic accident in the wilderness was now a chilling crime. Who had led the teenagers off the trail? Who had silenced their laughter and buried them in the soil? And perhaps most haunting of all, why? Detectives reopened the case, pouring through old evidence, revisiting witness statements, and scouring phone records from that night. Families who had once clung to hope now clung to the need for justice. They demanded answers, even if those answers were years late. The community, once bonded by grief, now simmered with unease. Could the person responsible still be living among them, blending into daily life while carrying the darkest of secrets? At the trailhead, fresh flowers and candles appeared once more. People left notes addressed to the 5 friends, promising they would not be forgotten, that their story would not be silenced again. The mountain, once a place of adventure and beauty, had become a memorial site, its paths forever marked by the tragedy that unfolded there. Yet the mystery lingered. The belongings, the fractured remains, the eerie stillness of that burial ground, they told a story, but not the full story. Some whispered that the truth would never be known, that the wilderness had claimed its secrets. Others believed it was only a matter of time before the missing pieces fell into place. As the press conference ended and families left with tears in their eyes, one thing was certain: the mountain had given up part of its secret, but it had not given up its entire truth. The question of what really happened to those teenagers on that fateful night still hung heavy in the Colorado air, unanswered, haunting, and waiting.